I was especially asked to do a weekend on fulfilling Bible prophecy. I had, of course, given the normal list, but Brother Rafiq came back and said, no, we don't want anything off your normal list. We want to hear something about how dramatic it has been for the last couple of years, and especially 2016, in relation to the fulfilment of Bible prophecy. So let me make a prophecy, brothers and sisters and friends, at the outset. Many of you, of course, will be quite familiar with the things that have happened, and many will have heard much about it. But I believe that at the end of this weekend, we are going to see it in a package. We're going to see just how complete it has been, and that we're going to conclude, as I have concluded, that God is actually doing something very special for each one of us. He's actually saying to us, I can't do any more for you than what I have done in 2016. That's what I believe he's saying to us. Now next year, of course, and it's not too far away, is it? It's 2017. And we do know that God works in Jubilee cycles. 1897, 1947, 1917, it's the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration next year, is it not? So you've got 1917, 1967, and another 50 years on from 67 is 2017. We know that God works that way, that something dramatic will happen. Now, whether it's the return of Christ, we can't say. What we can say with some certainty that we are living on the cusp of great things. And I hope it is the return of Christ. I believe that the package we have been given is telling us that the return of Christ is very near, and that's why we've got the title, Lift Up Your Heads, Your Redemption Draws Nigh. So as we go through this, I'm going to have time to do what I normally haven't got time to do. Actually deal with it at some length, because I've just given a talk, some of you have seen it, at the end of the year at my own ecclesia. It was entitled 2016 in Review, The Hand of God in Human Affairs. And you're going to hear some of that. If you've seen that, you're going to hear that again, but you're going to hear it in a context where I have time to actually spell things out. There was absolutely so much. I had to leave stuff out. So much that it took me an hour and 20 minutes and I still didn't deal with it properly. So let me just give you a promise. The sessions are not going to be an hour and 20 minutes, okay? But they will be long enough to get through this material. We're going to start where we should start, with the nation of Israel. For we know that God's eyes are on this land every day. That's the testimony of Deuteronomy 11 verse 12. A land which Yahweh thy God careth for. The eyes of Yahweh thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year, even unto the end of the year. And of course we know there are passages like Psalm 121 verse 4. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep, and he certainly hasn't been sleeping this year in relation to the events in Israel. And Zechariah 2 and verse 8. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. So we're going to see just how important some of those quotations from the Old Testament are in relation to what we have seen this year. But of course, we have to take a step back to November the 8th, and another amazing, astounding event, wasn't it? The election of Donald Trump as President-elect of the United States of America. Who expected that? Very few people. I mean, the world today is still stunned, aren't they? You've got all these idiots running around trying to stop Trump becoming president by saying that it was all, there was all sorts of things that happened, and Putin got involved, and there was a miscount, and all sorts of things. They can't accept the fact that a man who didn't have seemingly the qualifications to be their president is their president. So how did that come about? Well, I believe Donald Trump has been put there by God for a reason. He's likely to be a catalyst to bring about the Great Depression of the 21st century that everybody knows is coming. It's only a question of when. And he, even if he puts into place even 10% of his policies, will probably bring that crash about. He'll impose some kind of tariffs on China, etc., etc. So we're going to see some dramatic things, I believe, coming up in the next little while. You know, neither candidate, Trump or Clinton, passed the normal character test, did they? They were both seen as unsuitable for office. But Trump won because God made sure of it. As I said, world opinion is absolutely aghast that this man has been elected. Do you see the sign? This is the Time magazine. The end is near, they say. Well, they don't know what the end is, do they? But we do, and we can see it coming. So few foresaw this outcome. But you see, during his election campaign, Donald Trump did something that other candidates in the past have not done. He showed his support for the nation of Israel. It didn't seem to matter to people that he was accused of disrespect for women and moral treatment of women, racism, tax dodging and a whole range of things. It didn't seem to matter that he offended many in his own Republican Party. People voted for him. And they voted for him for a reason, we believe. You see, when God works in the affairs of nations, it doesn't matter about public opinion, because he sends forth the angels. And we know that that is the declaration of Daniel chapter 4 and verse 17. This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, says Daniel, to the intent that the living may know. Of course, it's no good to those who are dead, is it? But when we see the hand of God at work, it's for the living. It's for the living to sit up and take notice. That the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to him whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. Now that word basest can be used in two ways. It can, of course, be used in relation to our Lord Jesus Christ, who was the lowest of men, the least esteemed of men. But of course it's also very true, is it not, that right down through history God has put in place base men to rule the nations. And we've got one now who's going to be the President of America. Now, this verse, of course, is the reason why we as Christadelphians don't get involved in politics. We don't go out and vote. And we don't vote because we don't know who God wants. Who would have voted for Trump if we did vote? See, we don't know. But he's there because God does put in power the basest of men for his purpose. But it's also the reason why there's nobody on earth more interested in politics than Christadelphians, is there? We are interested because we can see the hand of God at work in the nations. So what animated so many people to vote for Trump? What animated the people to vote for Brexit? Why did the Italians just a week or so ago throw out their Prime Minister who wanted them to change the Constitution? Well, the answer to that is simply anger. Anger is what is animating many people in our world today. They simply want something to do something about the problems that beset them. And they couldn't see the establishment as doing that. So they put in a man who they think at least will take some actions. He will do something. They were angry. They didn't care about his character. There was an article in the Time magazine in June this year, and they called this the anger election. All right? And it was, wasn't it? The anger election. So why is anger an important element in the latter days, do you think? Well, because it's a fulfilment of Bible prophecy. That's why. Because Revelation 11 and verse 18 says this. And this is just 3 or 4 verses after verse 15, which says that the kingdom of this world will become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. All right, so it's in the context of the setting up of the kingdom. And the verse itself tells us that. Because in Revelation 11 verse 18 we read, and the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come. So what time is it? The time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. That word destroy there in the Greek means to rot thoroughly. And there's no doubt that our world has caused corruption across the board in morality, in all sorts of ways. They have corrupted this world. And their time is about to come. And so is ours, brothers and sisters. It's the time of the dead that they should be raised. So why am I talking about Donald Trump, do you think? Well, because he has this attitude towards Israel that is so different to his predecessors. Even George Bush didn't have this kind of attitude towards Israel. So during his campaign, he made clear what his policies toward Israel were. He spoke of his unbreakable friendship with the State of Israel, that he would give much stronger support for Israel in the United Nations, and of course that really means using their veto power in the Security Council. So if the Security Council makes a resolution, nations like Russia and the 6 members, they can actually veto it. And so he's going to use the veto power of America a lot more. So he says. His number one priority is to dismantle Obama's disastrous nuclear deal with Iran. Now, whether or not that happens, we'll have to wait and see. He says he will not allow Israel to be treated like a second-class citizen by Arab states. He says that the US embassy in Israel will be moved to Jerusalem. Now, that's going to cause a few waves, isn't it? Because the Palestinians are not going to like that. They're going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. Well, we'll have to wait and see whether or not he keeps those promises, because there's other things at work here, as you're going to see as we proceed. So, there's a prophecy that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this alleged policy of Donald Trump towards Israel. And it's this prophecy here in Jeremiah chapter 30. I want you to have a look at it with me, Jeremiah chapter 30. Now this chapter is in the dream of Jeremiah, which goes from verse 4 of Jeremiah 30 through to verse 26 of Jeremiah 31. And this dream is based upon the return of Jacob from Haran back to the land. And of course it's used as a vehicle, as a type of the latter day restoration of scattered Israel back to the land through the work of Christ and Elijah and the saints. So it's in that context. And we know the context is very plain because it says in verse 7 of Jeremiah 30, "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." So this is the time of Armageddon. And we know that that's true when you read on, and if you go down to the very last verse, the last 2 verses of Jeremiah 30, it talks about the whirlwind of Yahweh. And it goes on to talk about his fierce anger in verse 24, that it will not return. So this is the time of the setting up of the kingdom of God. It's the time of Armageddon, the restoration of the Jews from all parts of the earth. So what's going to happen in relation to Israel and its former friends? Well, we're told in verses 13 and 14 of Jeremiah 30, says this. Verse 13, "There is none to plead thy cause, that thou mayest be bound up. Thou hast no healing medicines. All thy lovers have forgotten thee. They seek thee not. For I have wounded thee with the wound of an enemy." It goes on to talk about Israel's corruption at the end of the days. And we'll have more to say about that in due course. So what we're being told in this prophecy is that just before Armageddon, Israel's going to lose all its friends, all its former friends. Now, when you talk about lovers, it means that they've been there in the past. They're the lovers of the past. They're going to forsake Israel, it says. So that's why I have grave doubts about Trump ever being able to fulfill much of what he said about Israel. Because, you see, US has been the most preeminent lover or friend of Israel for 50 years, 60 years or more. So we'll go into that as we proceed. Let's have a look at the attitude of the nations towards Israel. Of the 175 United Nations Security Council and the 690 General Assembly resolutions passed before 1990, and that's what, 26 years ago, 27 years ago, prior to that, this has gone on. It's gone on since then, and there's a huge list. You can go and have a look at a huge list of the resolutions against Israel in the United Nations. So, of those 175 and 690 before 1990, 97 of the 175 and 429 of the 690 were directed against Israel. So they haven't had too many friends, have they? Because the United Nations has voted against them many, many times. Since 1990, Israel has survived by the US using its veto in the Security Council most of the time, not all the time. The US under Obama, Britain, Australia and Canada have shifted their attitude towards Israel recently. Fortunately, the British now have a new Prime Minister, and we'll talk about her a little later on. And she has redirected British policy towards Israel just in the last week. So things are changing there. So what about Donald Trump and Israel? Why is he so friendly towards Israel? Well, he has a daughter called Ivanka by his first wife, Ivana, and she's married to a Jew and is committed to Jewish orthodoxy. They keep the Sabbath and all that kind of thing. He's also got many Jewish friends. And during the election campaign, he boasted he would be a much stronger supporter of Israel than Obama and Clinton. And, in fact, from the predecessor in the Republican Party, George Bush. Now I want to take you, if I can, to Luke chapter 21, which is what we read as an introduction to our study here this afternoon. I want to focus now upon the fig tree of Israel, the unmistakable sign of Israel. And while you're tuning that up, you're probably looking at the screen and saying, what on earth are the words there on Donald Trump's cap as it appeared in the Time magazine in June 2016? And the words on his cap read, "Make America 1968 again." Now, what's that about? Why would the Time magazine pick on 1968? Well, I want to show you. You haven't heard this before. It's quite dramatic what's in Luke 21. If you've heard it before, it won't hurt to hear it again. Okay? So here's got a cap. Now, of course, he didn't wear this cap. This is the Time magazine. This is a cartoonist who's put this cap on his head. But over here, you've got another gentleman. This is George Wallace. You know, he came from, what was it, Georgia, southern states, and he was a really hard right-winger. And he's dead. He's been long since dead. But he's saying here in this cartoon, you go, rich boy. Us versus them. Anger needs a win. All right? So this I found very significant. Because in this article they said this, no less a symbol of that awful 1968 political season that Lyndon Johnson used to favour the biblical quote, "Come, let us reason together." Johnson himself failed in the end. And so did the entire country in that bleeding year. And it was a year of bleeding generations ago. We paid a steep price for our rage back then. And if we're not careful, they said, we'll pay it again. So we're going back to this question of anger. We see a lot of anger in our society. And that's the message of Luke 21, isn't it? I'm going to show you that as we proceed. You know, 1968's a little while ago, isn't it? Sort of in the year when I was baptised. I was baptised in February 1967, and I'm, sort of getting towards the end of the days. So when I talk about this, many young people look at me and say, well, what are you talking about? But the world knows, the historians of the world know how important 1968 was in the scheme of things. The BBC had a 3-part series on 1968 in 2008 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of this year. I picked up this Time magazine in Tasmania on the way down to a Bible school in January 1988. It was the 20th anniversary of 1968. And there was this front cover article, obviously, on 1968. So what is so important about this year? And why is it so important to you and me? Well, it's important to you and me because Christ predicted it. Christ said it would happen. And I want to show you that. No question about it. He said it was going to happen. And it has happened. So let's just follow this through. So let's come to Luke 21 and pick up the record from verse 24. Verse 24, we believe, was fulfilled in 1967. It says this, "And they shall fall," this is a reference to the Jews, and you can go back and you can read, this is the events of AD 70 that precede it. "They, the Jews, shall fall by the edge of the sword," which they did, not just in AD 70, but again in the period up to 135 AD and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and thereafter. "And they shall be led away captive into all nations," which occurred. "And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Historians say that there have been at least 1,000, some say 1,100 armies that have marched through Jerusalem since that time. So it's been trodden down. You might be aware, of course, that the name Jebus, which Jerusalem had for 500 years, from the times when, in the early days of the Judges, they lost control of it, and it was taken by David through the work of Joab. Remember that? For 500 years it was called Jebus. You know what Jebus means? Trodden down. So Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Let me just say this. I wasn't intending to say this, but I must say it. Jerusalem has had its last treading down. The old city of Jerusalem is not going to fall into the hand of an invader again. And that's the clear message of Zechariah 14 and verse 2. Because we are told in that verse that while the Gogian forces will take most of the land, all of the land basically, they will not conquer the old city of Jerusalem. There will be Jews holding out in that old city until Christ and the saints arrive on the Mount of Olives. That's what the next verse is about. Then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And there will be a remnant of the Jews. That city has had its last treading down. Most of it will be taken, but not the old city, not the area that the Jews said that they would defend to their last drop of blood. And they will. So we've got a very, very important passage of scripture here. It's telling us that 1967 was one of those signal years, a milestone year in the fulfilling of Bible prophecy. And as I said, it happened to be 50 years after 1917. And what happened in 1917? Well, Allenby rode into Jerusalem. In fact, he walked into Jerusalem. He took control of Jerusalem. And that was the year, on the 2nd of November, when Lord James Balfour wrote the Balfour Declaration, which the current Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, says is the most important letter ever written in history. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? I'll give you the quotation a little later on. The most important letter ever written in history. And we believe so, because you see it was part of the process of getting the Jews back to the land, exactly 50 years after the events of the Balfour Declaration and the recapture of Jerusalem by the British forces. We had the events of 1967. That's why I can say with some confidence we can look to 2017 as being a huge year in the unfolding of Bible prophecy in some way. But what about the next verse of Luke 21? Well, the next verse is verse 25. So if you can say with some certainty, and we believe we can, that verse 24 is 1967, what do you reckon the next verse might be about? Well, I'll tell you what it's about. It's about 1968. Because 1968 divided the past from the future. And the world knows that. Even if we don't, the world knows it. Okay, and I want to show you that. So what does verse 25 say? And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. That sounds like anger to me, doesn't it? This is the kind of anger that was on the cap, remember that cartoon cap of Donald Trump? That the anger of 1968 returns? Yeah, and it has. And they're fearful, of course, of where it might lead, because of where it led in 1968. The unravelling of the establishment. You know, the end of the Vietnam War. All that sort of stuff happened. A lot more happened, as you're going to see. So what are these sun, moon and stars? Well, we know they're symbols. They're symbols, in the case of the sun, of political powers, the ruling powers, just as the sun rules the heavens. We know that the moon, which derives its light from the sun, is a symbol for state religions. Okay, so we know those symbols pretty well. And we don't have any problem with stars, do we? The world today is full of so-called celebrities, and they call them stars. There are film stars, there are sports stars, there are all sorts of political stars. We don't have any problem with that language. So we know what this is talking about. It's talking about the shaking of what's called later on the powers of heaven. In other words, the powers of government, the people in prominent places. 1968 was the beginning of that process. It immediately follows the events of 1967. And that word perplexity, of course, we're familiar with that. Perplexity is the Greek word aporia, which means at a loss for a way to proceed, to have no resources, no way ahead, which of course we can see, can't we, is the character of the times in which we live. So these powers of heaven symbolise the governments of the world that would be shaken by the events that flowed from 1968. We know, of course, that the sea is a symbol for nations in Scripture. No problem with that. We don't have to even stop to prove that. But have a look at what the Time magazine in 1988 said about 1968. Under a heading, like a knife blade, the year severed past from future, they said this. The spasms of unrest seemed almost psychologically coordinated, as if a mysterious common impulse had swept through the nervous system of a global generation. 1968 had the vibrations of earthquake about it. America shuddered. History cracked open. The year was pivotal and messy. It produced vivid theatre. It reverberates still in the American mind. 1968 was tragedy and horrific entertainment. Deaths of heroes, uprisings, suppressions, the end of dreams, blood in the streets of Chicago. That was the year, of course, of the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And Paris and Saigon. And at Christmas time, almost ludicrously, man floating around the moon. And that's how the Time magazine presented. They know nothing about the Bible, do they? They're not writing from a biblical perspective, but they're writing in almost biblical language. Why are they doing this? Well, because you see, they saw the significance of the year. We should see the significance of Luke 21 and verse 25, because it's a prophecy by our Lord Jesus Christ that when the dramatic events of 1967 and the Six-Day War occurred, that we're going to see more dramatic things. Now, we've seen some pretty dramatic things in 2016. I think we're going to see more dramatic things in the year that follows. They went on to say this, and then look at the heading of this particular part of the article. It was a huge article, by the way. They say, after 20 years, the apocalyptic, that's a biblical word. The apocalyptic events of 1968 are still reverberating. Now, this is about the assassinations. So under the heading and end of heroes, they wrote, the year had many legacies, but the assassinations were among the most important and were the hardest to bear. They altered history and broke something essential in the national morale. They broke hope. The best leaders of our time were dead, Tom Hayden says. Now, he was a leader of the anti-Vietnam War movement at the time. They had been murdered. That is the heart of the tragedy. By 1968, I knew I was part of an apocalypse, which is different from the early idealism. You feel, notice these words, remember that word perplexity in Luke 21:25? That means you've got no control, but you can't see a way ahead. He said, you feel you are carried by events that are out of your control. And they were. Now that is telling us something, isn't it? I will guarantee, I'll give my right arm, that not one of the writers of that article in the Time magazine organisation has any clue of its relationship to the words of our Lord Jesus Christ. They haven't got a clue. But you read that and you think, oh, they're talking about Luke 21:25. Yeah, and they are. That's how important 1968 is to you and me. So what happened? Well, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was shot in San Francisco after an election, one of the primary elections. There was riots in Paris, in Mexico City. There were Russian tanks in Prague. There were all sorts of things happening all over the world. It was an unbelievable year. And you didn't go to Paris in 1968, because that's what it looked like. Well, that's Paris in 1968. The world had never seen anything like that, because they'd had 2 world wars, but they'd never had anything like that in peacetime. It was a new era that had arrived for humanity. 1968 divided the past from the future, and we're in the future. And we're a long way down the track of that future, aren't we? We're in the end of 2016. It's a long way from 1968 for most of us who are younger. What is that telling us? Oh, I think I know what it's telling me. Lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing nigh. That's what it's saying very, very loudly. But he goes on, of course, he gives another sign, doesn't he, in Luke 21 in verse 29. He spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. And I want you to notice, he doesn't just talk about the fig tree. He says, behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. Now, you know about this a lot more than we do in Australia because you have a very severe winter. And then, of course, you've got you've got a spring and then you've got summer and things start to grow. And, of course, summertime is what? It's the time of harvest. It's when you harvest a crop. Harvest. Yeah, that sounds a bit like Armageddon to me. Heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. Divine judgments are in, as it were, a time of harvest. That's what Christ is talking about. He's talking about the coming of Armageddon. And that will lead to the establishment of the kingdom of God, which is why he says in verse 31, so likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. And then mention is made of the generation in verse 32. Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Now, you know, there's been a lot of question, debate about that generation. Some say, well, it's 40 years and that's long since gone if you're talking about the nation of Israel in 1948. Generation, brothers and sisters, is simply a lifetime. My father was alive in 1948, baptised, Christadelphian, married. I came along in 1949, so this is the era of the formation of the State of Israel. This was the time when on the 14th of May 1948, Ben Gurion stood up in the museum in Tel Aviv and declared the State of Israel. All right? That's the era. My father's still alive. He's old. He's still alive. And there's many others that are still alive who saw that event. But they're getting close. They're getting close. And I really think that's telling us something. So what does he mean by the fig tree? Well, we know from Scripture that the fig tree is a symbol for the nation of Israel. You can go to places like Joel 1 verse 7 and verse 12, Hosea 9 verse 10 and Jeremiah chapter 24. We know that the fig tree is used as a symbol for the nation of Israel. But what about all the trees? He says, behold the fig tree, Israel, which came, of course, into life again in 1948, and all the trees. Well, trees we know are symbolic in Scripture for nations. Ezekiel 31 is full of it. And when Israel became a nation in 1948, there were 57 nations in the United Nations. And the vote went 33 for, 13 against, 10 abstentions, and 1 absentee. Makes 57. United Nations today has 192. So since 1948, what's that, 70 odd years, whatever it is, that in that period, it's gone from 57 nations to 192. And that's why Christ says, behold the fig tree and all the trees. He's saying it's not just going to be Israel that pops up. It's going to be many nations. And we've seen that. So there's another fulfillment. And we read, of course, these passages of what that really should mean to you and me. So let's just summarise what the Lord has been saying here in Luke 21. So 1948 is the crucial year of the fig tree of Israel shooting forth leaves. No fruit yet, of course, but shooting forth leaves, alive again in the earth. And from there, of course, we had many dramatic events. We had the mad period for humanity, mutual assured destruction through nuclear weapons period. And then we, of course, had the 1967 Six-Day War, a terminal event in many ways. And then we had 1968, the era of perplexity. And then we had many events that flowed from that, the problems of 73, 74 and the lack of fuel. Because of the war between Egypt and Syria and Israel. We had 87 stock market crash. We had the 91 recession. And of course, involved in all of that was the Gulf Wars, etc. And we had 9/11 in 2001. We had 2007 and 8, the global financial crisis, which of course the world's still suffering from. And you can add to that a plethora of other problems that are burdening humanity. And we know about them. We don't need to talk about them. We know about them. That's the era of perplexity. How long can it go on, do you think? Well, not too much longer, we would imagine. Because we're in that period of time. The Lord says this is the time of the end of the Gentiles. Got to come soon. And you know, all of these things can be packaged into one little passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, where Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, who'd been in the truth for 5 months. And he said to them, "But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you." They were sufficiently instructed to be able to read Bible prophecy. "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night, and tragically it will be, like a thief in the night, to far too many. For when they shall say peace and safety," and we're going to say a lot about that in a moment, "then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." All the mothers in this room know full well that when a child is about to be born, and you get into that last couple of weeks, and then you get into the last week, the last few days, you know that the birth pangs, which can be spaced out, you know, the initial stages, you know it's coming. You know, as you get closer, bang, bang, they get shorter and they get more severe. We're in that period of time. And the birth pangs will lead to a birth. And the world doesn't know it's coming, but you and I do know it's coming. I want to talk now briefly about the matters that we'll be involved in this series of studies, in the forthcoming studies, God willing. I want you to just come with me briefly to Ezekiel 38. So I'm going to give you a bit of a rest for the remainder of this session. I'm not going to pile too much on you. What I'm going to do is talk about what Ezekiel 38 requires, especially in relation to Israel, and then we're going to have a look at the nation of Israel today to lead us into our next study. Ezekiel 38, we're pretty familiar with, aren't we? So if you had to summarise what it requires prophetically, how would you do that? Well, here's an attempt to do so. It requires, in the early verses of Ezekiel 38, that a dictator dominates the Eurasian continent. And when we use the word Eurasia, we mean Europe and Asia. So there's got to be a dictator. His name, of course, is Gog, which means the one at the top. A dictator who is like an umbrella over other powers. Well, I think we might see that kind of thing in Vladimir Putin. Whether he turns out to be the Gog, only time will tell. But he certainly established the regime, the system, the dynasty that has that character of being a dictator. And of course, he fits perfectly the requirements of Habakkuk chapter 2, if you've ever looked at that. Ezekiel 38 requires that the territory east and north of Israel be under Gogian control. That's the message, clear message of verses 5 and 6, and we'll talk more extensively about that subsequently. It requires a dependent Europe falling under Gog's political control without the need for conquest. There's no reference in Bible prophecy to Europe having to be conquered. It simply falls into the Gogian camp. And I'm going to talk about that. That's actually happening. Big time, all right? And next year is going to be a dramatic development in that. No question about it. And the world knows it's coming too. And they're very agitated by the prospect. So we'll talk about that as time permits. Then we have the West Bank. If you have a look at verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, without reading the whole verse, just read from the middle of the verse. It says that Gog comes in the latter years against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations. All right? They come against the mountains of Israel. Now, I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows you where the mountains of Israel are. That prophecy in verse 8 requires the annexation by Israel prior to Armageddon of the West Bank. Now, think about what a traumatic affair that has been for our world for such a long time. this question of who owns the West Bank, whether it should become a Palestinian state, has been, of course, one of the great problems for nations for decades. It's about to be resolved. And I'll show you how it's going to be resolved. Okay? And it requires to be resolved. Israel must annex the West Bank. And by the way, when Netanyahu won the last election, one of the first things he said was Israel will eventually annex the West Bank. And that's why they're building settlements there, hand over fist. We were there in 2010 to have a look at parts of the West Bank. We went to Shiloh, for example. Now, Shiloh was, as the scripture said it would be, barren. It's just rocks on a hill. Guess what was there when we went in 2015? A brand new Israeli settlement. Unbelievable. In 5 years, they built this magnificent Israeli settlement against international law. All right, so Israel doesn't take any notice of it. They will annex the West Bank in due time, and this prophecy requires it, as you'll see in a minute. Verses 8 to 11 also require that Israel be at peace internally and with its near neighbours. They're a long way from that, but it's happening, as you're going to see. It also requires that they be very prosperous and envied by other nations. So when the Great Depression, the 21st century, does occur, brothers and sisters, it's going to bring nations like the US down to their knees. Israel, like all others, will suffer. We all suffer when there's some kind of depression. But Israel will come out of it much better than most nations, probably than all nations, and they will be the envy of the world. You're aware that Israel's number 3 on the NASDAQ? That's the index that talks about companies in countries and prosperous companies. They're number 3 behind the US and China on the NASDAQ. Well, where's Germany? You know? So you see there's things happening. And I want to just take you through a list of the things that are happening. And of course, Ezekiel 38 verse 13 requires that Britain be allied with its former colonies in opposition to Go. And it also requires that the peninsula states, the Saudi Arabian peninsula states, will oppose Go. And we'll go into those matters as well. So this is just a brief summary of the requirements of Ezekiel chapter 38. So let's have a look then at the matter of the West Bank. You see this map here of the land. The red line, of course, is also called a green line. That's the West Bank. All right, this is the area. So where are the mountains of Israel that are in the land? Well, 90% of them are in the West Bank. They start down here at Hebron, 3,300 feet, whatever that is in metres. They go up here to Mount Gilboa. 90% of the mountains in the land of Israel are in the West Bank. Now, they're not called the mountains of Palestine, are they? So when we went to Shechem in 2015, we walked into the place where they've got the old city of Shechem. We wanted to go and see the old city of Shechem. So we go in and there's a brand new sign at the gate. And at the top of the sign it's got the state of Palestine. Idiots. They're not going to have a state of Palestine in the West Bank because the Bible says no. All right? But they think they're going to get one there, and they're not. And the wheel is turning. It's turning against the Palestinians, as you're going to see a little later on. Israel will annex the West Bank before Armageddon, as Netanyahu plans. And this is going to help. This is going to help. On the 15th of December, what are we up to now? 17th or something like that, is it? So it's 2 days ago. On the 15th of December, Donald Trump named David M. Friedman, who's clearly obviously a Jew, who's aligned with the Israeli far right, as his nominee for ambassador to Israel. So why is that important? Well, one, he's a Jew, which... Ambassador to Israel, maybe you could choose a Jew, couldn't you? But this is the important thing. He has outspoken views that stand in stark contrast to decades of American policy toward Israel. And one of those views is this. They include that it would not be illegal for Israel to annex the West Bank. Now, I wonder why Donald Trump has nominated him. His views have been known for for years. He's been saying for a long time that it's not illegal for Israel to annex the West Bank. You can see where that's going, can't you? So we're on the cusp of Ezekiel 38 verse 8 being fulfilled and the West Bank being annexed by the nation of Israel. Let's have a look then, as we come to the end of this session, at where Israel stands in the scheme of things today. You know, for 50 or 60 years, Israel was ruled by socialist prime ministers. They began with David Ben-Gurion and went right down to the prime minister prior to Benjamin Netanyahu, who came into office initially in 1996. And because of that 4 decades of rulership, 4 or 5 decades of rulership by socialists, Israel was a basket case. You know, they were in great need of help from America and other nations. They had economic sluggishness, and it was obvious they were going nowhere as a nation without support from others. Everything changed. Ezekiel 38 verse 12 requires that Israel be very, very prosperous at the end. And Benjamin Netanyahu was God's way of achieving it. He was an American educated MBA, a Master of Business. He became Prime Minister in 1996, went through to 1999. He was then replaced, of course, by Ariel Sharon, remember that? Who, you know, just happened to have a stroke in 2004, ending up being a vegetable. And because he wanted to keep Netanyahu away from challenging him for leadership, you know what he did? He handed Netanyahu the poison chalice. And the poison chalice was the finance ministry. Now, nobody in their right mind would want the job as finance minister of Israel. But Netanyahu said, thank you very much. In 2003, he pushed through the Knesset policies that changed the whole landscape of economics and finance in Israel. You know what he did? He adopted, I'm not boasting, but he adopted the Australian and Canadian banking models. All right? You're aware that in 2007 and 8, when the global financial crisis hit, that the countries who came through it the best included Australia and Canada. Why? Well, because they've got strict banking regulations. Okay? So he adopted them, along with much other helpful policy. And, of course, he turned the economy of Israel around. And now today, everybody's begging to know what the secret is. All right? They want to know what Israel's secret is. That is how God brought that change. He wants to fulfill prophecy. He puts the right men in place to do it. And Benjamin Netanyahu was one of those. So Israel prospers in many and varied fields. Computer technology, they lead the world in that area. Agriculture, arts, science, weapons development, oil and gas, diamonds. All the diamonds that are cut in the world, you know, are cut in Israel. They're all cut in Israel because they've got the expertise. So, let me have just a brief review with you of where Israel stands today. Let's take Israel in business. I mentioned NASDAQ. Israel has more NASDAQ-listed companies than any other country besides the US. More than all of Europe, India, China and Japan combined. So while they're third on the list in terms of performance, they've actually got more NASDAQ companies. There are only 8 million people. All right? More NASDAQ companies than Europe, India, China and Japan combined. It's incredible. But in proportion to its population, Israel has the largest number of startup companies in the world. In absolute numbers, more than any other country beside the US. That Israel has attracted the most venture capital investment per capita in the world, 30 times more than Europe. That relative to its size, Israel is the largest immigrant absorbing nation on earth. It has absorbed 350% of its population in 60 years. I mean, Germany's struggling, aren't they, with 1 million Syrian refugees. Think about Israel. That Israel has more Nobel Prizes per capita than the United States, France and Germany. it has more laureates in real numbers than India, Spain and China. That Israel is the only country in the world that entered the 21st century with a net gain of trees, made more remarkable by the fact that it is 60% desert. They've planted more trees than any other nation on earth. That 93% of Israeli homes use solar energy for water heating, the highest percentage in the world. That Israeli scientific research institutions are ranked third in the world. That Israel is ranked second in space sciences. Good grief, space sciences? Yeah, they're right up there. That Israel is one of the 10 countries in the world capable of launching its own satellites. That Israeli universities are among the best in the world. That Israel produces more scientific papers per capita than any other nation by a large margin, 109 per 10,000 people, as well as one of the highest per capita rates of patents that are filed. That Israel has the third highest rate of entrepreneurship amongst women in the world. That Israel's $300 billion economy is larger than all of its immediate neighbours combined. That Israel leads the world in patents for medical equipment. That Israel has one of the best healthcare systems in the world according to the OECD. Wouldn't the Americans like to know about that? All right? That Israel is among the top 3 countries in cyber attack defence. That Israel has the highest ratio of university degrees to population in the world. That Israel is the second most educated country after Canada. Had to put that in. No, I'm in Canada right now. Well, where's that going to lead? You know where it's led? It's led to arrogance, self-dependence, no faith in God, and moral corruption of the highest order. Do you know what Tel Aviv is today, brothers and sisters? It is the European capital of homosexuality. And I've seen it with my own eyes. We were there in April 2015 and we drove through Tel Aviv. And there up on the walls are the banners, the rainbow banners. I can hardly say that without getting very angry. But they would use the symbol of the rainbow for that filthy activity. But there they are. And they're proud of it. And they're promoting it. And we're going to talk about that. In the next study, we will look at Israel's latter-day self-confidence and arrogance and corruption, which is again a fulfilment of Bible prophecy. And we will see from Ezekiel 39, verses 24 to 26, that that's exactly what was predicted would happen at the end of the days, the latter days. Recent massive finds of oil and gas will make Israel even more self-sufficient for decades than they already are. Israel attributes, of course, its success to its own ingenuity and endurance under duress and attack and oppression. Many of the Holocaust generation, of course, don't even believe in God. And it's one of the fascinating facts of history that God used the atheistic Jews to create the state of Israel. He did not use the religious Jews. You know why? Because they opposed it. The religious Jews opposed it. They were against what was happening in 1947 and 1948. So he couldn't use them. He used the atheistic Jews who came through the Second World War and the Holocaust, and they cried out to God for help. Please help us. And year after year they got no answer. They just got worse treatment. And in the end they concluded, well, we're supposed to be the people of God. And we call out to him for help and we don't get any help, so there can't be a God. So they came back to the land in their own strength. That's how God has brought about the state of Israel. The fig tree of Israel, brothers and sisters, is an unmistakable sign of where we sit in the scheme of things. We're not too far away. It is time to lift up our heads because our redemption is drawing nigh. In our next study, God willing, we'll look at Ahaz and a covenant that he made with the Assyrians of old. And we will see that as a prophecy of what latter-day Israel is doing right now. And 2016 has been a year in which they have made huge steps in forming a covenant with the latter-day Assyrian, the nation of Russia.